Okay, good evening. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I want to start by just talking briefly about the life of Ida B. Wells and why she merits a title like To Tell the Truth Freely, which I think is very central to who she is. Wells was born in 1862 in Mississippi during the middle of the Civil War in a town that was actually kept switching. The Union kept capturing it, and then the Confederacy captured it. And she grew up during Reconstruction and then witnessed the African American loss of civil rights that followed Reconstruction. And she was someone who would grow up and eventually realize that what she really had to do was to expose and confront the kinds of injustices she was seeing. So what she did was she had a very difficult childhood. She was orphaned at age 16 in the yellow fever epidemic that came through the Mississippi Valley in 1873. She ended up taking care of her 5 surviving brothers and sisters by becoming a teacher. She had just high school education, incomplete, but she taught herself how to teach and eventually taught herself how to be a journalist. And part of what inspired her to be a journalist and an activist was just the kinds of things she confronted as a Black Southerner. For instance, the incident that led her to becoming a writer was when she was forcibly hauled off a railroad car during the years of sort of beginnings of segregation. Railroad cars were originally actually split into smoking cars and ladies' cars. So Black women such as Wells would sit themselves in the ladies' car, which was the more comfortable car. It was further from the engine. It had seats. Smoking wasn't allowed. But then as the South was beginning to segregate all sorts of facilities starting in the 1880s, they would find themselves not allowed to sit there anymore. So Wells, when she was ejected from the ladies' car, launched a court case. When she was ejected, she launched a second one. She won in the lower courts, lost in the higher courts. It was very discouraging to her. She is someone who actually saw the rights that African Americans had gained after the Civil War disappear. Her generation witnessed it, and she was very conscious of it. And her response to it was to expose it. So she started writing about those railroad cases. And then she would ultimately encounter even worse adversity that would inspire her to greater heights. And that occurs in 1892 when there was a lynching in Memphis, where Wells had moved, Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis, Tennessee, prior to 1892, was a bustling city with a growing Black community, including a Black middle class, of which Wells had become a member. Over time, she had gone into journalism full time. She had bought part interest in a newspaper. She was traveling around the South on the railroad train, selling subscriptions, and doing very well and feeling optimistic about not only her future in the South, but those of other African Americans. But she returned home from one trip in the spring of 1892 to find that there had been what could only be described as a sort of race riot in Memphis that had begun when a Black boy and a white boy fought over a game of marbles. The fathers got in the mix. There was eventually an altercation at a local Black-owned grocery store called the People's Grocery. When Black men defended themselves from armed white men who came into the store, there was sort of a massive sweep in which hundreds of Black men were arrested, and 3 of them were ultimately taken out of the Memphis jail and lynched. Those 3 were the proprietors, one of the clerks of the People's Grocery Store, and one of them, Thomas Moss, who was also a mailman and a Sunday school teacher, was one of Wells's closest friends, along with his wife Betty. So Wells comes home from one of her trips to find Memphis, African Americans fleeing Memphis, Thomas Moss dead, his wife Betty in mourning, and the 3 men were lynched, and the papers are kind of defending lynching as a Southern practice. But Wells, who hasn't seen it up close like this before, is really struck by the disjuncture between the way lynching is being represented and what actually happened. The implication with lynching is always that black men are these bestial criminal types who need to be kept under control by these extra legal measures. But Wells had good reason to know that in particular, in this case, these men were not criminals. They were upstanding young men. They were pillars of the community. Thomas Moss taught Sunday school. He was liked by everybody. He held 2 jobs. There was no accusation of any kind of crime, and in fact, one of the leaders of the lynch mob had been the owner of a competing white-owned grocery store. So she saw another story with lynching in Memphis, and she began to investigate other lynchings, and found out that fully 2/3 of lynchings were not associated with any kind of sexual crime or accusation of a sexual crime. They frequently involved labor disputes, disputes over money, and she also found that even when there was discussions of rape, if you actually talked to the people in the community, it would come out that there had been some kind of consensual relationship between a white woman and a black man, which had been discovered by someone who didn't like it, often a father or a brother or so forth. And this had been when the accusation of rape or the discussion of rape had begun. So Wells wrote about this in her newspaper and published an editorial on it. And once again, she was traveling, which was fortunate, because the morning after her editorial came out, a white mob stormed her newspaper, planning to lynch the editor. They couldn't find her. They weren't even sure who wrote it. They tracked down her business associates, but she was warned, and she could never come back to Memphis. And the title of my book, To Tell the Truth Freely, comes from what she resolved to do afterwards. She was devastated. This paper that she had built up from nothing and put all her life savings into was gone. She could not return from the town where she had made her home. But instead of being discouraged, she actually resolved that she would fight, that she would leave the South but not forget about what had happened. So she moved to New York. She got a job with the New York Age, and she dedicated her next few years to what she called telling the truth freely. She talked about lynching. She wrote about it. She published a pamphlet about it, several pamphlets about it. She traveled to Britain. She talked to anyone who would listen. And her what she understood about lynching, which I don't think had been so clear even to earlier black activists, was that it was a phenomenon that was often that people had not actively protested because it was very challenging in the 19th century to talk about things like rape, sexuality, even if you were saying there wasn't rape, even if you were talking about consensual sex. It was a time in which these things were not things you were supposed to talk about publicly. And one thing that Wells had the insight to realize is that African Americans couldn't combat lynching without actually talking about what was going on, talking about those consensual relationships that triggered violence, talking about the rape myth that was being used to justify lynching and exposing it, talking about the kinds of sexuality that went on in the South and kind of demystifying the whole thing. And that's what she did. The people in Memphis and much of the South continued to issue death threats against her for many years as she continued to talk. She kept talking. She had trouble finding audiences. She's someone who is an example of almost all the difficulties you can encounter when you tell the truth. You can encounter violence from people who don't like it. You can be ignored by people who don't want to hear it. And you can have trouble getting the people who are willing to listen to you to do anything. But that would be her motto, and she had a strong belief in getting the facts out to the public. And she also, I would argue, also understood that there's certain kinds of social problems about which you need to alter the public narrative. And with lynching, the issue was that she had to really take on the stories being told about it, and recast it as a crime and as something that was not serving the purposes that it was claimed to serve. Lynching was supposed to keep order, it was supposed to keep the criminal types from misbehaving, but Wells argued that it was used to keep black people down, to maintain white supremacy, to support all the other forms of racial discrimination that existed in the Jim Crow South. And it ended up being a very powerful argument that was adopted by many subsequent civil rights workers and organizations afterwards. So those are among her great contributions. Thank you.